Hello, and welcome back to Radicals, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. So last week we sort of covered I guess the beginning of radical politics and, early radical ideas and things like that. And then we moved into the Federalist and Democratic Republican Party and talked about their various, divergences and what eventually led to the fall of the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party, and the divide over slavery, and we sort of left it off there. So this week we are going to be talking about what further divided the Democratic Republican Party, and then the split, and we'll move into the abolitionist movement and talk about how that was such a driving radical idea, and we'll then talk about two major players in the abolitionist movement. So, to start, the continuing divide between the North and the South was, I guess, worsened with Missouri, which was just kind of a battleground state almost, as far as laws about slavery and restrictions to slavery and things like that. A lot was done in Missouri. So in 1820, the Missouri Compromise was signed into law. This law made Missouri a slave-owning state and Maine a free state. So kind of weird two states to for that compromise to be over. But it also prohibited slavery, with the exception of Missouri, in the entire Louisiana Territory, which was all the land purchased through the Louisiana Purchase. This law lasted until 1854, when it was undone by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In 1821, the Adams-Onis Treaty was a treaty between the U.S. and Spain that involved the Spanish relinquishing some land, namely Florida, to the United States. And Florida had kind of become a safe haven for escaped slaves to go to. They could escape in the Deep South and they could run to Florida. But now with the U.S. owning Florida, or Florida being part of the U.S., it left slaves with no southern states to flee to. Interestingly, just kind of on a side note, the presidential elections in the 1820s were all between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, and these were strewn with preposterous claims about the opposition in very similar fashion to our most recent election. So, people were, I think even one claimed that the other had killed somebody, and there were just some wild things going on there. But John Quincy Adams won in 1824, and in 1828, Andrew Jackson won. So just kind of a trade-off, and all of that drama was really for nothing. Now that we're caught up on the events of the 1820s, let's move into the abolitionist movement. So the abolitionist movement is a movement that started in the United States in the 1830s and lasted through the 1870s. And its primary goal was to abolish slavery. A similar abolitionist movement originated in Western Europe in the 1770s, and, the American abolitionists sort of modeled their movement after that. And essentially, abolitionists wanted to create the emotional climate necessary to end transatlantic slavery. So, in 1833, the American Anti-Slavery Society was formed, and this was primarily the activist arm of the abolitionist movement. And it was formed by an individual named William Lloyd Garrison, and he was an American journalist and publisher of the Liberator newspaper, which lasted from 1831 through 1865. By 1840, the Anti-Slavery Society had grown massively, and it had over 2,000 auxiliary societies and anywhere from 150,000 to 200,000 members. And, it had just grown to be a huge movement in the short span of about 10 years. And essentially, these various societies signed petitions, published journals, and distributed anti-slavery propaganda throughout the northern U.S. Now we're going to move on to discuss Frederick Douglass, and he was an American born into slavery in 1818, and he became a very prominent speaker and writer and just overall activist in the abolitionist movement, for, all the way through the end of the Civil War and into the Reconstruction era. So, he was separated from his mother at birth and raised by his grandmother until the age of 6, when he was sent to work at the Y House plantation in Maryland. From this plantation, he was, quote, given to Lucretia Auld, whose husband sent him to Baltimore. It was in Baltimore that Frederick was taught the alphabet, and his interest in writing was piqued. After being taught the alphabet, Frederick taught himself to read and write, and then went on to use that knowledge to educate other slaves. After several failed escape attempts, Douglass managed to flee by way of train in 1838, and he then settled for a bit in New York and married Anna Murray, who was a free black woman who he met in captivity in Baltimore in late 1838. This couple ended up having 5 children together. In his transition from slave to freed slave and then to abolitionist leader, Douglass moved his family to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where they met Nathan and Mary Johnson. This couple were born freed persons of color and were responsible for the Douglass surname taken up by the family. This name came from the Sir Walter Scott poem, The Lady of the Lake, and Nathan and Mary Johnson strongly encouraged Frederick and his wife to take up the name Douglass. It was also in New Bedford that Douglass began attending abolitionist meetings, and it was here that he was first exposed to the writings of William Lloyd Garrison, who would serve as a great inspiration to Douglass, and we just spoke of Garrison a little bit earlier. And the two would meet after some time, and Garrison encouraged Douglass to become a speaker and leader within the movement, obviously noticing Douglass's ambition and strong feelings and convictions about slavery. By 1843, he was part of the American Anti-Slavery Society's Hundreds Connections Project, a 6-month tour across the U.S., and it was during this tour that Douglass was physically assaulted several times, and after one particularly brutal attack, his hand was broken. It was never fully functional again either after this incident. So now we will sort of move to take a look at some of the written works of Frederick Douglass, namely his most famous work, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. His most famous quote from this book reads as follows: "From my earliest recollection, I date the entertainment of a deep conviction that slavery would not always be able to hold me within its foul embrace, and in the darkest hours of my career in slavery, this living word of fate and spirit of hope departed not from me, but remained like ministering angels to cheer me through the gloom." His work of hope would go on to inspire many slaves to rise up against their destructive system. So essentially, in that quote, he is just saying that in his darkest moments of slavery, when he felt the most downtrodden, this hope of being able to be free one day would just kind of live within him like a spark and would get him through those really dark times. After writing his autobiography, Douglass took a trip to Ireland and Great Britain, where he preached of the hypocrisy in the U.S. and worked to gain more global support of the abolitionist movement in America. So, America was founded off these ideals of freedom and, trying to escape the iron fist of the British government. And, they promptly began holding slaves themselves and, became hypocrites of the very word they preached. Upon returning to the United States, which was growing less and less united with each passing year, Douglass began publishing his own newsletter, The North Star, and involved himself in the women's rights movement, but we are going to cover the women's rights movement in much more depth at a later date. Come 1852, he was an established speaker and writer in the abolitionist movement, and he delivered another famous quote: "What to a slave is the 4th of July," referring to the confusion in a holiday celebrating the freedom of only some Americans. During the Civil War, Douglass worked to end slavery and then to secure the right of newly freed black Americans to vote. And though he agreed with Abraham Lincoln for quite some time throughout the Civil War, after the deliverance of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, they would fall into some disagreement, as Douglass wished that Lincoln would have used the speech to grant freed black men the right to vote, especially since they had fought with valor alongside the Union Army during the Civil War. It is said that they later reconciled with the passing of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which abolished slavery, granted former enslaved individuals citizenship and equal protection under the law, and protected citizens from racial discrimination in votings, in that order. So, those amendments were obviously huge as each one brought more and more rights to people of color in the U.S. Sadly, at this time, it really only pertained to men, but that would change in the coming years. In his later years during American Reconstruction, Douglass served in many official government positions and became an ambassador to the Dominican Republic, making him the first black man to hold high office in the United States. This was obviously huge for the former slave community, as, they had this idea that, government was really only for white people, and it was always only going to be for white people. But Douglass did kind of shatter that belief when he became the ambassador to the Dominican Republic. These and many other accomplishments over his long life would follow Douglass to the grave in 1895 when he suffered a heart attack. Douglass was a vital part of the abolitionist movement and was radical in his words and actions against slavery in the established system of the United States. His works live on today and mark a time when African Americans did not have the faintest shadow of the rights they now enjoy. And, even with the rights that everyone now has, there is still much work to be done in establishing a national sentiment of total equality among men and women, regardless of race, gender, age, and many other things. So we're going to kind of wrap today up by talking about Harriet Tubman, who was another vital black activist in the mid-1800s. Born around 1820, there is no exact date or year, since record-keeping was so bad. In Dorchester County, Maryland, Harriet was born into slavery and served as a cook in the big house on the plantation. She had 8 siblings, but with the way slavery worked and the buying and selling of these people, they became separated, and she was not able to stay in contact with all of them. By the age of 5, she was rented out as a nursemaid, where she was whipped whenever babies cried, leaving her emotionally and physically damaged. And, you can imagine a 5-year-old who had that kind of fear of being whipped, especially over something out of their control, like a baby crying. That's just incredibly, incredibly sad to think about. Around the age of 7, Tubman transitioned to being a planter and would continue doing field work for about the rest of her career as a slave. And she escaped by way of the Underground Railroad in 1849. So one other notable moment in her early life came at the age of 12, when she ran to the defense of another slave who was going to be whipped for attempting to escape. When she came to his defense, she was struck with a 2-pound weight, leaving her with a lifetime of severe headaches and narcolepsy. So one running theme we've seen between both Douglass and Harriet Tubman are lifelong injuries at the hand of anti-abolitionists. And, you can imagine how that would have festered within them to only drive them harder against slavery. So upon escaping, she traveled 90 miles north and found work as a housekeeper in Philadelphia, but really was not content with her life of freedom and sought to free other enslaved people around her. It was then that she began her work with the Underground Railroad. Contrary to popular belief, she was not the founder of the railroad, rather a major influence in its success. She helped dozen sources, some go as high as 300. Those are likely to be conflated numbers. It is safe to say that she rescued at least 70 slaves through the Underground Railroad. And she is famous for quoting that she never lost a passenger on the Underground Railroad, and she also participated in many other abolitionist movements. Through her work on the Underground Railroad, she learned much about Southern traveling routes, towns, and other information that made her an extremely valuable asset to the Union during the Civil War. During the 1850s, she befriended Frederick Douglass and many other abolitionists, and would, serve alongside them in trying to tear down the slave system. During the Civil War, Tubman found new ways to fight slavery. She first worked at Fort Monroe as a nurse, cook, and laundress, and later in 1863, she became the head of espionage and the scout network for the Union Army. In doing this, she was able to provide crucial intelligence to Union commanders and other, individuals that were vital to the success of the Union. In her later years, Tubman settled on land that she owned in Auburn, New York, and married a former slave by the name of Nelson Davis. She had been in a marriage previous to this, but it was not historically, it's not considered to be a good marriage, and her husband wasn't even willing to escape with her. He stayed. So, after marrying Nelson, she went on to have several children and is famous for having an open door policy for anyone that needed support, and her vast philanthropy network was upheld from selling homegrown produce, raising pigs, and accepting donations and loans from friends. Although she was illiterate, she toured parts of the Northeast, speaking on behalf of the women's suffrage movement and abolitionist movement. Sadly, pneumonia took Tubman's life on March 10th, 1913, but her legacy lives on today. And even today, the Treasury Department plans to replace President Jackson with Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. So Harriet Tubman really was a vital, working piece among thousands of abolitionists. These are just two of the most notable because of their work in their various respects. But it's important to note that there were thousands of these radical idealists in the 1800s that were pushing for the rights of slaves and, the abolition of slavery. And you can see that both Douglass and Tubman were crucial in their radical ideals. This is certainly one example, or two examples, where radicalism was not detrimental and was in fact entirely necessary to move society into a better place. But next week we will cover the anti-abolitionist movement and the radical individuals involved in it. So that's going to be a bit darker of an episode, but I think it will be very interesting to see sort of the competition, I guess, who was fighting against the abolitionists and what ideals did they stand on and why did they think they were in the right. So we will be covering all that and more next week on Radicals Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. Thank you all so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of the week. One last final note. I am sorry this episode is coming out a day late. It'll be coming out today on Sunday. This past week I had to make a trip out to Massachusetts for the funeral of my grandmother. So, I'm just glad I could get it done at all. But yeah, thanks guys so much for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll talk to you all later.